Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the big news of the day. As the 27th Conference of Parties to the Climate Change Convention has wound to an end at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, the countries party to the Climate Change Convention have taken a major decision to establish a loss and damage fund. So this happens to be a historic development as far as climate change negotiations are concerned. So let's try and understand this topic in detail. So at the 27th Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Change Convention, the member countries have decided to establish a dedicated loss and damage fund which will compensate some of the vulnerable nations which are already bearing the maximum impact of extreme weather events that have been driven up by climate change. So small island states, poor vulnerable countries are already facing the maximum impact of extreme weather events such as increasing frequency and magnitude of floods, droughts, forest fires, cyclones, etc. So the increasing impact of these natural disasters have been directly linked to climate change and global warming, and vulnerable nations are facing the maximum impact of these developments. So to compensate these countries, the developed nations have agreed to contribute to a fund called the Loss and Damage Fund. But however, other than this, COP-27 has failed to achieve any concrete outcome on limiting greenhouse gas emissions or on phasing out fossil fuels in order to achieve the target of keeping global rise in temperatures to under 1.5 degrees Celsius as agreed to under the Paris Agreement. So overall, the summit is being seen as a failure as countries haven't achieved anything substantial with regard to reducing emissions and with regard to phasing out fossil fuels. But however, the decision to establish the Loss and Damage Fund is seen as a historic decision as it would help compensate the vulnerable nations which are facing the maximum impact of climate change. In fact, this movement to establish a Loss and Damage Fund was started nearly 3 decades ago by Vanuatu, which is a small island country in the Pacific, along with the Alliance of Small Island States. Especially the small island states, which are likely to face the impact of rising sea levels, they came together and urged the developed nations, which have contributed to historical emissions, to provide them for compensation for all the loss and damage that they are likely to incur. Until now, climate finance has largely focused on cutting down CO2 emissions, that is shifting towards cleaner energy sources. And most of the climate finance that has been delivered till now has only helped the communities to adapt to the impact of these events. But these small island states and vulnerable nations have never been truly compensated for the damages that they have suffered, and they are likely to suffer in the future due to increasing frequency and magnitude of these natural disasters. That's the reason why they are demanded for a loss and damage fund to cover the cost of the damages that they are likely to incur, not just to life and property, but also to infrastructure and biodiversity. A total of 55 vulnerable nations had come together to raise this demand, and through groupings such as G77, even developing nations like India had given complete support to the vulnerable nations with regard to their demand for a loss and damage fund. This compensation demand stands at around $525 billion, or around 20% of their collective GDP of these 55 vulnerable countries, and this could further increase to $580 billion by the end of the decade. Several environmental groups and activists also had backed the claims of the vulnerable nations to establish a loss and damage fund so that they could receive direct compensation from the polluters, that is essentially the large developed nations which bear the burden of historical emissions. With regard to climate finance, the only step which had been taken was in 2009 during the Copenhagen summit of 15th Conference of Parties, when the developed nations had promised a green climate fund that would provide climate finance of up to $100 billion a year starting from 2020. But this promise has never been realized as the developed countries failed to act on it. So it's in this context that the establishment of a loss and damage fund is being seen as a major development. This dedicated fund, which will be financed by the developed nations, will compensate these vulnerable nations. And this concept of loss and damage specifically refers to the impact of climate change, which cannot be avoided either by mitigation efforts, that is by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or through adaptation measures, that is, by modifying the practices to create a buffer against the impact of climate change. So essentially, few vulnerable nations are likely to face the impact of climate change despite all the mitigation adaptation measures. Increasing frequency and magnitude of these natural disasters is likely to cause a significant damage to these small countries, and the loss and damage fund will compensate these countries on these specific grounds. It will help these vulnerable countries to cover the cost of economic damage that they are likely to suffer due to increasing natural disasters. And the compensation will not just extend to loss of life, but will also cover loss of property, loss of livelihood and infrastructure, and as well as destruction of biodiversity and sites of cultural importance, which are increasingly being threatened by climate change linked natural disasters. India has reacted to this historic development and has welcomed the development and has called it a historic decision. Because since several years, as a leader of the G77 group, India was backing the vulnerable nations for their right to be compensated through a loss and damage fund, which was actually being resisted by the developed countries such as United States and members of European Union. The developed countries were hesitant to commit to a loss and damage fund because they feared that they would be held legally liable to pay compensation to the vulnerable countries for the massive damage that they are going to suffer because of climate change. So for many years, developed nations led by US kept opposing the loss and damage fund, and that's the reason why the agreement at COP-27 to establish this fund is seen as a major diplomatic victory for the small vulnerable nations over the developed countries. But however, there are still many issues and concerns which are yet to be addressed. Even though the fund has been established, there is still no clarity as to how exactly the fund would be set up and who would manage the fund. There is also no clarity on the contribution that is to be made by the developed nations. And there is a possibility that the developed countries could push large developing countries like India also to contribute to the fund, as today the developing nations are also seen as large emitters. These critical questions have been left to be answered by a transitional committee whose recommendations will be adopted at the upcoming Conference of Parties. And hence, the operational aspects of the fund is yet to be decided, and this has been left to future COP negotiations. However, few European countries like Scotland and Belgium have announced nominal commitments, but it is still not clear as to what other countries would contribute to ensure that at least $500 billion is accumulated in the loss and damage fund. The concern for large developing countries like India is that during the negotiations for loss and damage fund, European countries, which are members of EU and even the United States, they were pushing the other countries like India, China and even West Asian countries to contribute to the loss and damage fund, as today they are seen as large emitters. But this position of developed countries may not be acceptable to India and even to China and other large developing countries, as they are not responsible for historical emissions. This could likely lead to further conflict at future climate change negotiations. So as a result, the loss and damage fund may not become operational immediately. But however, the decision of the Climate Change Convention to even establish this fund should be seen as an incremental gain, and one should hope that the countries will act responsibly, especially the large developed countries which bear the burden of historical responsibilities. And this should further catalyze the top polluters to pay for climate finance, especially to compensate the vulnerable nations. So on this note, I would like to bring my discussion to an end. And if you found the initiative to be helpful, do let us know by liking the video, share the video with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.